Alan Wu, thank you for talking to me on for this interview for the documentary.
You're very welcome.
What's weird is I know you. I would see you in the booth, but I almost would never see you because you were always working and directing the show from the booth.
Yes, crazy because we had such a limited time from conception of the show of a meeting that happens at I think it was 10 a.m. was our meeting to find out what we were going to do that day till actually 4 o'clock to making it happen. So there was definitely a crunch time that happened probably around starting at 2 o'clock, where we had to rehearse all the essential parts of the show, all the bits and stuff. It got very hectic. So to see me on the floor was a rarity, and having any extra time, even more rare.
I almost never saw you, but I heard your disembodied voice. I would hear that. First question for you is how you got involved as director of Attack of the Show. I know, and what was your journey to G4 TV? Because you began as a director on X-Play, if I understand correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, but tell me about your journey to G4 TV and then as the director on Attack of the Show. And I may put you full screen and take myself off screen while you answer sometime, and then I'll come back. So, okay. Cool.
So my journey to G4 started in, I believe it was around 2006. I was filling in at the time. I would come in and fill in for either the AD or the director Genji, and G4 had migrated over to NBC Universal, and I had done a lot of work with them before. So I got on their list when they were looking for somebody, came in, observed, and eventually, got more and more work with them. So when X-Play became a daily show, they were looking for a director, and they offered me the gig. And that was my entrance into G4. And then once I got in as a staff director at G4, going into Attack of the Show was just a natural progression. Whenever, Genji needed to take a vacation, whatever, they just automatically put me in to fill in for him.
Tell me about what made Attack of the Show so unique for a show of this type, a daily live show. That's, first of all, that is a huge undertaking. It's a huge undertaking to do that kind of show. And now it's become rare. But to do that kind of show at the budget level that it was being done was like unheard of. So what were your main challenges on a daily basis? You mentioned, just the grind of like, okay, you come in 10 a.m., boom, first meeting, the read through of the script, like around lunchtime or over lunch. And then and then the show by hell or high water is starting at 4 o'clock, West Coast Pacific time. And then it's over. No matter what happens, it's over. What were some of the main challenges you faced, like on a day-to-day basis, powering through that? What were some of the challenges you faced, and how did you overcome those?
I think the main challenges of doing a live show every day, 5 days a week for an hour, is that you don't have the luxury of doing things over again. You do a rehearsal of something and you rehearse it until you get it right. And hopefully when you're live, it happens that way. Oftentimes it doesn't, but then oftentimes those are the best parts of the show. When the train gets off the rails and something doesn't go as planned, and seeing how the hosts react. And the great thing about our hosts, Kevin and Olivia at the time, they could just keep going, and they could take things, knowing that it's not going right, and just, make it their own. And sometimes those are the best moments of the show. The other thing about the other challenge of this show was that it was a low budget compared to, many other shows. And the The producing team was very limited, and it's just very impressive what they could pull off with the limited resources that they had. But I think what did it for them was the love of the show, love of the work that they were doing. And it's really reflected in the show itself. You could see it. And for a lot of it, the show always felt to me like these guys were doing a show for themselves. Like, this is a show that they would want to see and do and watch themselves, but they were able to actually create it. And it's that love that I think people, the viewers, understood that and would made it different from any other show out there. We often got guests that, made the rounds on other shows, and it was always better. We're not better, but just different on G4. It wasn't, you could watch them on 5 other shows and their interview and questions would be the same on each show. But when they got to G4 and they got to Attack of the Show, it was a different interview. It was different questions, or they were doing things, physicality things, doing bits with us. And it just made it more fun and enjoyable for them. And a lot of guests would mention it too. It's like, wow, this is great. I love doing this interview, or love being here, and I think a lot of that started on Attack of the Show. And I think you see it now on, The Tonight Show with, you see now in The Tonight Show, they do bits like that. But then, of course, one of the EPs of the Tonight Show at the time came from Attack of the Show, so we could see where that was born. And even some bits that were, quote, stolen, unquote. For instance, there was a segment we had, Time to Sports, where Kevin hosted a sports show but knows nothing about sports. And, the Tonight Show kind of did a ripoff of that segment. The other thing that was really challenging in the show is, it was challenging and exciting at the same time, is you would come in the morning and have a meeting. I think it was at 10 a.m. and you'd find out what you were doing that day. And you never knew it until that day, because it was something maybe like that was on around the net that someone had found, and some bit spawned off of that, and you'd have to develop that bit and then give all the notes to art department with all the props they would need, and they would scramble to get it, to studio, hopefully by 1:00, sometimes not until, half an hour before the show went live, but they always came through. And being able to rehearse these bits in that time, and it's the live element is what gave the show its energy. Everyone had to scramble, knowing that we were on a deadline. And if it wasn't live, this show, could have shot like all day, for the content that we put on there. But the live aspect of the show was definitely what gave the show the edge and the energy that it just people could see. And being live and having audience feedback, audience reaction via, the Twitter wall, which was a first at the time too. Nobody was doing Twitter on air, and we had that instant feedback. But, just going back to the challenges, live was always, the biggest challenge of that show, but also the most fun of that show.
You mentioned earlier some bits being lifted or borrowed. I mean, that obviously, I think you're referring to Gavin Purcell, who agreed to be interviewed. I'll be talking to him. I'm sure he wouldn't deny it. My understanding is that Jimmy Fallon, who appeared on Attack of the Show, was a fan of the show. He was a fan of Attack of the Show and its kind of approach and humor. And my understanding is that he pursued Gavin to take over the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. I don't know how much you know about that, or if you want to comment on it, but let me know if you want to comment on that. I would take it more as a compliment. It's like whenever I see a mainstream media outlet lift something from Film Threat, which has happened to me. It happened to me. Entertainment Weekly, there were a couple writers there that were constantly lifting ideas out of Film Threat when I was a small magazine in the 90s. And I was mad, but I took it as a compliment, like, oh, yeah, I guess you got to lift ideas from this small underground movie magazine. But would you mind talking about that a little bit?
I think Jimmy Fallon was a huge fan of the show, and when he got his show on NBC, when they named him as Tonight Show host, I think the show, actually, no, it was before the Tonight Show. He started the show after the Tonight Show at the Late Night with Jimmy Fallon, right? When Jimmy got his own show at NBC, I think he modeled it after Attack of the Show because he was a big fan of the show and was like, that's the kind of show I want to put on. And, went to the source, basically, went to one of the EPs of the show and hired Gavin, gave him a great opportunity. And they took, some of that Attack of the Show magic over to NBC.
Yeah, I remember actually running into Jimmy Fallon in the makeup room. And I looked at him, I was like, oh my gosh, that's Jimmy Fallon. And he was just like, I said, I'm a big fan. And he goes, I'm a fan of you. He said that to me. I don't know how honest he was, but I know he watched the show. So, why would he BS on that? You mentioned earlier, and I want to talk a little bit more about that, the different experiences that when people would do the talk show circuit, I feel like they sort of like, well, it's earlier in the day. Sure, we can come by Attack of the Show. And sometimes those segments, sometimes they were pre-taped, if I recall correctly, with the celebrities. I could be wrong. But like they would get these people they were promoting a movie or they're promoting something, and they would do Attack of the Show. And it was vastly different than other things. I mean, when you look at like, in particular, James Cameron, his appearance. Can you talk about maybe some specific appearances of people who were guests on Attack of the Show and maybe elaborate a little bit more on their experience on Attack as opposed to your traditional shows where you're basically just selling your latest movie or project?
I think when guests came on Attack of the Show, they were a little bit more relaxed to come on. And maybe it was because they knew that nobody was watching. But a big part of it, I think, had to do with Kevin doing interviews. He always had a way of making everybody more relaxed and stuff. And when we did interviews or bits, like introducing him to these bits and like telling him what we'd like him to do. And I think being on cable gave him that venue to say, oh yeah, I can do this, or not being on a traditional talk show where it just come down, sit on a chair, and answer questions. It was, hey, we'd like to do this with you and have fun. I think a lot of guests were very open to it. I mean, no other show I think would have James Cameron come in and take a folding chair and smash a mannequin called Drunkle Ted over the head with it, and have fun with it like that. He was always very open to doing bits like that. Or on his entrance, I remember he came smashing through a wall of cardboard boxes. But yeah, we gave the opportunity for these guests to show a different side of themselves too, and just be themselves and just have fun and be more relaxed than any other show would give them that opportunity. One of my favorite guests and bits was Allison Brie, and she's sitting down with Kevin in there. They're making, I believe it was tuna fish sandwiches with their feet, which was definitely something you would never see on any other show.
Oh my God. You're right. It's so funny, in going through all the footage that we've collected and kind of categorized. It's pretty remarkable, like that this was just every day, like, okay, we have ideas, sort of scouring the internet in the early morning. Casey walked me through kind of how the writers, like their life in their day, right? And then suddenly it's like, well, it goes on the air, it either works or it doesn't. Tell me a little bit about your working relationship with the hosts. you were fortunate enough to work with, Kevin, among others. Do you have something you can say about Kevin, Olivia, what they were like, what might surprise you to learn? I can just tell an anecdote of my own. But what I always loved about Kevin is that he went out of his way to relax you. Because I consider myself someone who did television, but begrudgingly. I was more of a writer, and that was my day job, film threat writer, right? And then I'm going to be on TV, what? And he would do this thing where he would say, hey, I want to show you something. And he didn't do this all the time. And he would show you the most vile, disgusting, horrible thing on his phone. And then suddenly I heard Andy say 3, 2, 1. And I'd be like, and you would catch me shot with a shocked look on my face, like, what? So yeah. But what are some things just that some anecdotes? Someone mentioned that there was a story, and I don't know if you were there, if this was Genji, that because you and Genji basically directed the bulk of the show. It was about 500 episodes each, But there was a time where Olivia was kind of trying to build her film career, and she came in and just said, look, I just want to let everyone know, I am not going anywhere. I'm here for good, whatever. I'm not going anywhere. Forget all the rumors. And then 4 days later, it was announced that she was gone. And I guess that video, someone shot that video and took that clip of her saying that, and they would just play it on the set just for just to make Kevin laugh, right? But there was definitely and having, I had previous experience. I worked at IFC. I did shows for Stars. I did a couple different shows for FX. And I didn't love being on camera. I think that was more my issue than anything else, just being comfortable. Attack of the Show was my best television experience ever, and it was the only time I was allowed to be myself on camera. And I think that was true for almost everyone who was on camera. You were allowed to be yourself. I guess this is just a big buildup to get you thinking while I'm talking. Any anecdotes you might have about hosts, whether it's Allison Hayslip, Chris Hardwick, Kevin in particular, which is the best person I've ever worked with in television, bar none, period. Olivia, what could you say if you went down the list of hosts, if you had an anecdote about each one or an experience that you could recount, how did they make your job as director easier or challenging in a good way, keeping you on your toes? I always felt that Kevin made me better. He was like, you're going to go for it. I hope you can keep up. Boom, go. This is I'm saying this in a long-winded way to get you to sift through your memories and experiences and what you feel you comfortable discussing. So okay. let me know tell me about each of the hosts and what your working experience was and any anecdotes and stories.
Okay. I think working with the hosts, mostly I worked with, Kevin and Olivia during that time. They were the main hosts, and they were just a pleasure to work with because they could, they were great at reading prompter, but also doing camera turns. But Kevin especially had this camera awareness, and he could, watch a program monitor through his peripheral vision and see things. Because we always used special effects. We had keyable effects and stuff. And for instance, if we had a Halloween show or something, maybe a bat flying through the screen, and you could only see it on a program monitor because it was a keyable element. But he could see it in the corner of his eye and he could react to it. And he could duck, even though it wasn't physically there, he knew it was there. He could see it and play with it. And that's a talent that you don't get with many people. Most people are oblivious to it, but Kevin always knew. The one thing I loved about working with these hosts were they were so natural on camera, and they were just being themselves. And it was like they were just having fun and goofing around. And the script was a guideline for them where, this is the show, but they could also riff with one another and play off of each other, which was, something you don't see often. A lot of people are always, have to stick to the script, and then you go off script, they get lost. But Kevin and Olivia had a way of, reading the script, riffing off of each other, and then eventually getting back to it. Some of the magic, that came from that show is kind of screwing up on script. One of the best moments was Olivia reading prompter, and instead of saying MC Hammer, she said Mick Hammer, and was totally oblivious to what she had said. And Kevin picked up on it right away, and he started laughing. And Olivia was like, "What?" She was like, "What are you laughing at?" And when he finally pointed it out to her, just her reaction to it and the embarrassment of it. But it just became one of the funniest bits on that show. And then I think the next day there was a bit with a character, Mick Hammer, and he became like a recurring character on the show as well. And that just all spawned from a live natural moment on the show. And, those are priceless. Moments like that are just, priceless. You can't recreate those. Those are just, that's part of the magic of that show is, being able to react off of those moments and moving on and, creating something, spectacular off of those.
Would you say that when the show went well, it went well? And when the show went off the rails and bad, it went well?
Yes, absolutely. Like whenever we did a rehearsal, that was the objective. That was the goal of how you wanted the bit to run. But sometimes things don't always happen the way you do it in a rehearsal. And sometimes those are the funniest moments. Just as a comparison to SNL, when people break character and, or they lose it, because it's live and they start laughing, then those are often the moments that are appreciated the most. And people understand it because it's that live moment, and it's almost more fun to watch a train wreck, in that way. Yeah, that was part of the draw of that show, knowing that you're watching a live show and anything can happen. In my history of working in television, which spans about 3 decades now, Attack of the Show is the only show that I had seen standards and practices take the screen to like a blur. Many people, watch live TV and they hear bleeps and people swear on TV. This was the only show I've worked on that ever blurred out the entire screen because of content. And that was definitely a first for me.
What? Okay, I don't know. Well, first of all, I know Keith was our standards and practices guy, and I don't know if you're aware he passed away recently. Oh, yeah,
no,
yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's going to be a whole thing in the credits of people who passed away from Attack of the Show in the time. Jim Downs, Monica Kuna, John Walsh.
Yep.
Yeah, so there'll be a thing in the credits about the people that have lost. I can't believe it's been 10 years, and it's but I would ask him what I could get away with, because I was always looking to push the limits. And I said, "Can I mispronounce swear words?" And he said, "Oh yeah, you could do that." So I don't know if you're aware, I would say Shahid on the show. And it didn't have to be bleeped because I mispronounced it. But can you tell me what was the thing where the whole screen had to be blurred?
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell me the story behind that, and then elaborate more, if you would, on just like working with Kevin and Olivia, because you got to sit with them at not, I mean, you did the rehearsals, but also, they would go through the script and whatnot. It's amazing to me how much happened all in one day. But tell me what happened with this full screen blur, which was a first in cinematic history or television history. Sorry.
So I think one of the hardest jobs on the show was for standards and practices. Our guy, Keith, had two buttons. One was to bleep out anything that was said on audio, that, any swear words, stuff, he'd hit the bleep button. The other button he had was blur the screen if there was something visual that wasn't appropriate. And I had never seen that button used before, ever before in my entire television career. But there was this one situation where we had a guest, it was Eric Andre, and the host at the time was Michael Costa. And Michael was doing an interview with Eric, and for some reason, it led to this point where Eric stood up and dropped his pants. And on his, he was wearing these white boxers, and on his white boxers was this painted on huge black cock going down one of his legs. And you would think it would stop right there. But then he proceeded to pull down the boxers as well. And he kind of tucked his junk in between his legs and was just standing there like that. And, everyone was just in shock and awe. But in the control room, we could see it, on our monitors. But on the return feed, when you looked at the network return feed, the whole feed was just blurred. And that was the first time in history that I've seen that. And I'm kind of proud that I was there for that moment.
First of all, it doesn't surprise me coming from Eric Andre. I mean, I've watched his show. I love his show. It's sort of a deconstruction of talk shows, right? And it's, that came, after Attack of the Show, but it doesn't surprise me. I've heard him.
You have to find that moment, because that was.
Well, we'll find it. Can you elaborate a little bit more about Kevin and Olivia, and then maybe some other hosts too? I don't know how closely you work with Allison Hayslip or some of the other hosts, but if you wouldn't mind, if you have, because technically speaking, if you talk about them, I can show footage because it's fair use. So anyone else, if you have just sort of anecdotes or exchanges with any of the other hosts, in addition to Kevin and Olivia, maybe some other moments. I'm just fishing for moments for you to tell some stories about that.
I was going to mention, what was Matt's last name?
Matt Myra.
Myra, yes. Okay. I'll give a quick, so working with, Kevin and Olivia was always great. We got into the writer's room, did a read through at 10 a.m. and stuff, kind of figured out what the show was, came up with the bits, talked about it a little bit. But what you got in that read through was just the beginning. And you never really saw the end product until we went live. I think sometimes they even saved some of that for live, even during rehearsals. They would hold back, I think, knowing that in the live show we were going to do a certain bit. But the writer's room, where the read-throughs were always fun as well. I remember one time Kevin getting physical in that room, and he ran up to a wall, and I think was going to just kind of run up the wall or push off the wall with his foot, but his foot ended up going through the wall and with a big hole in that conference room, which was pretty funny. I think somebody might actually have that on a recorded video. I think somebody might have recorded it on a phone. But yeah, the read-throughs could be fun as well, but the real magic, was live. The hosts really saved themselves for that. Other notable hosts that were really great to work with were, Chris Hardwick was always a lot of fun. He was somebody that you didn't know what he was going to do until we were live. He definitely, always loved the natural reaction of an audience. So he didn't want to give his true performance during the rehearsals, but when we were live, would do it to get that natural laugh. It was, as a stand-up comedian, he knows the value of hitting, getting people to laugh naturally, and the difference between that and a laugh from something you've seen before. One of the other people that came out of Attack of the Show was Matt Myra, who was a good friend of Chris Hardwick's. He came on as a writer, but then eventually became more of a on-screen talent, and he was great. He was always good attitude, really likable guy, and very funny. One of my favorite bits with Matt was he was using a telestrator to show, I think they were flyers. I think they were flyers from stores showing like different sales. And he would circle things and, say, hey, this is on sale. You should buy this, buy that. And while, doing these drawings in the telestrator, he was basically, drawing penises and, getting away with it because Keith and S&P, I don't think was catching on, but it was like the funniest thing as he did this. It was just, he had a very natural way about him. Like he had good comic timing, and I think a lot of that was from hanging around Hardwick. They were good friends, and they had done a podcast together. And he was always. I knew from the beginning, just watching him, that he was going to be develop as a really good talent for the show.
Anything else like Allison Hayslip or any other?
You mentioned Allison. I can't like.
I mean, you could even talk about me if you wanted, but my stuff was pretty straightforward. I mean, I would just come in and do whatever.
I got something for you about you, which I loved about you. But ready?
I'm listening.
For Chris Gore, my favorite thing about doing Chris Gore was we always had a timer on Chris at the end, and he had to go through all this list of DVDs, or I forget what you had it in. It was like it was a little tray. What did you have? What did you have your DVDs?
It was called, the segment was called, we do it like once a month. And it was
DV Tuesday.
DV Tuesday, yeah. But the segment,
I remember you had like the 1 minute, right? And you had all your picks, but you had, what did you have? You had like,
it was called, once a month we would do a thing called Rapid Fire, which was this crate, but it was like jacked up with like big wheels in the back. And they made it like this. I got to keep it at the end, but I would do like as many sort of quick take reviews as I could sometimes it was 60 seconds, sometimes it was 30 seconds. It's called Rapid Fire, the DV Tuesday Rapid Fire, which was about once a month. So, but I'll let you recount that.
Yeah, I loved doing DV Tuesday in the Rapid Fire because you had like a certain amount of time. If you had 30 seconds or a minute, and you would try to go through as many DVDs as you could. And it was just so like really quick. And it was very funny because, you'd pick something and show it and, what you loved about it and throw it and, very next thing. And just kind of like a really rushed segment. And I always liked the time pressure that you had on that and how you tried to get through everything. And sometimes you did, and sometimes you didn't, but it was always fun to watch.
Talk to me about you've been a television director. That is your, career to today, 10 years after Attack of the Show has ended. The industry has changed dramatically. There's been a lot of change in the industry. Could you do a show like Attack of the Show today? And I ask because in our compiling the footage and kind of organizing it to use for the doc, we recognize that oh my God, you could never, some of these things one, you couldn't do MySpace Girl of the Week because there's really no MySpace, but what are your thoughts on, could you do a show like Attack of the Show today in an age when a simple comment can get you canceled or, called out online. What are your thoughts on like what Attack of the Show did, and then what the current climate is? And was Attack of the Show ahead of its time? And could you do it? Could you do Attack of the Show today?
I think Attack of the Show was definitely ahead of its time, where we would bring in live viewer participation. I remember before there was even Skype, we had Stickcam, and we can get, I think it was 6 viewers live on air, and talk to them, and they can react to us. And that was in a time where we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have FaceTime, we didn't have Skype, and that was like cutting edge technology at the time to be able to do that. The other thing that we started on the show when Twitter first came out, we put a Twitter wall up. No one else was doing that on TV, and we just got instant feedback. We do around the net, we do a bit, and then all of a sudden you get audience reaction on Twitter. Hey, look, Twitter's telling us this, Twitter's telling us that. Or someone on Twitter would ask, hey, can you do this? And we'd do it. And that was the first show of its kind that was actually doing real live feedback from the audience. One of the first shows that I had directed at the time was Kevin was on site somewhere in Middle America at somebody's house, a viewer's house. And to get this shot, they had to send a satellite truck. I mean, it was very expensive at the time. It wasn't something that you can, just stream over the internet. And the show actually, had this idea, and it was a great idea. And they would, put the funds behind it to actually book a satellite truck in time and go to this guy's house. And it was such a simple bit. They went to this viewer's house, surprised him, and then they offered him something. I forgot what they were giving him, but it was something that wasn't worth what they were asking him to do. They said, we'll give you this item if you shave off one of your eyebrows live on the show. And he was totally game for it and shaved off an eyebrow and, directing the show. I'm like, wow, like watching it, like it was the funniest thing I'd ever seen. It was like, there's no way this guy's going to shave an eyebrow off of that. And he ended up doing it. And I was like, at that time, it was one of my first shows that I had done with, and I was like, yeah, I love this show. And the thing about Attack of the Show and directing it is that I loved is that it's a show that I would watch, and to be able to control that and choose the shots that people are seeing was just an honor for me. In doing this show, we were, let's see, where am I going with this? In my television career, I love what I do, but it's always better when you're doing a show that you love as well, and a show that you would watch and a show that you're a fan of. I was lucky enough, like for me out of college, while I was in college, I used to watch a show on E called Talk Soup. And it reminded me, like looking back, like that was kind of like an Attack of the Show type show where it was, you'd watch it and you'd see the host and the crew members just having fun. And it seemed like they were doing it for themselves and not for the home audience, but the home audience enjoyed it as well. And getting on Attack of the Show was kind of like that for me as well. It's like a bunch of guys doing a show that they really love to do. And whether people were watching or not, they were going to do it anyway because they were just having fun and they loved it.
That was definitely the environment, like let's bring in all the interns, the producers, everybody. We're going to clap. Like it was, I could see sort of the evolution from Talk Soup, like that sort of vibe, which was, because I used to run into, who was the guy who was the like stage manager on that? He worked in the same building.
McNamara.
Oh my God, he was great. He was so funny because they'd work him into bits, and it kind of had the show also had that vibe of like, well, we're going to put on a show.
I don't know if you like this. That's actually where I came from. Like that was so I used to watch that show, and I used to watch Talk Soup in college, right? And then my first job out of college, I got a job on Talk Soup. And at the time it was Greg Kinnear hosting, and there was a time where, the network was new, and, same thing was like nobody was really watching this show, and they would do things on the show that you couldn't get away with anywhere else. And I think it was because no one was really watching. And I remember Tom did this thing. We started this campaign during the John Henson era where it was called Beer Across America. And we would just ask people, like, hey, you have microbreweries around your area, blah, 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 hey, send it to us. We'd love to try it. And it was just a scheme for us to get free beer. Well, like, beer companies picked up on this. One time we came in one day, and there was like a truckload of Corona waiting for us. And we built this throne of Corona beer cases, and Tom would sit on that throne. And he was like, "Oh, thanks to Corona for sending us this beer." And he was sitting on a throne of Coronas like a king. And then the head of ad sales came in after that show, and he goes, "You can't do that." Like, what are you talking about? It's like, you're promoting Corona beer. We have other advertisers, and stuff that, like, you can't, favor any products on this show. And it was like, that's how we knew, like, people were watching when we started getting like those big shipments and stuff. But it was Attack kind of reminded me of that. It was like, hey, we're just goofing around doing a show, and if people are watching, great. If not, we're gonna just keep goofing around and having fun.
Can you tell me a little bit about your experience, and correct me if I'm wrong, like I'm talking about some of the event shows like E3, CES, San Diego Comic-Con. Do you have some anecdotes, memories that you can recount about your experience involving those shows? Because I think that, I think that what really put G4 and Attack of the Show on the map was San Diego Comic-Con. That and it was also helped make San Diego Comic-Con into a larger, more mainstream and well-known thing. I mean, previous to 2005, when I started on Attack of the Show, I knew San Diego Comic-Con, but it didn't get like super like overly crowded until around 2007, when Attack had been covering it, and the level of coverage increased. Can you talk about some of the live event programming and what some of the challenges were, or anecdotes from those shows?
One of my favorite events on G4 and Attack of the Show was doing our live coverage from Comic-Con. And it was Comic-Con that I realized, how big G4 was. We were doing one show one year. We had a double deck booth where we did a show from the top deck. And there were so many people that, gathered around the booth that Comic-Con threatened to shut us down because we were causing such a traffic jam in that area, because people would just come and just, stay and watch the show. And all the vendors around us would complain because they wouldn't get any foot traffic, because it was just, all the aisles were just jam-packed with people. And it was looking over that sea of people that you realize, wow, like, look at the impact that we're having here. And, besides the impact of that show, even walking around Comic-Con, and we had our ID badges, or our passes that had our name on it, but they would also say G4. It was like, just being associated with G4, you were Comic-Con royalty over there. Going to parties, Comic-Con and the Gaslamp District of San Diego, the nightlife, afterwards is always parties everywhere. All these private parties you had to be guest listed for. And if you weren't on a guest list and you showed up there and they saw G4, most parties were like, yes, come on in. That's how respected G4 was at Comic-Con and in that nerd community.
I can also attest to that is true, that during that period when G4 was doing their live coverage, I think it was like 3 days over the weekend of live coverage. It would start like Thursday, Friday, Saturday. It was crazy. You would walk up to any party, not be on the list, and boom, you were waved in, because that's the G4 crew. Even better if you were walking around with a more well-known host. So that always helped. What were some of the challenges in doing the shows? I mean, for me, I was doing remote stuff and it was just intense, right? Like, and we were like filming segments that would be rolled in. And then there was this sort of live Kevin and Olivia, at the booth, doing all of that. And it was same with E3 too, same stuff. It was like an all hands on deck situation. Anything you can recount about doing that? Because what is a little disheartening now is that no one else has taken up that mantle, right? Like,
Yep.
No one else is giving these pop culture events the kind of, and I think it's diminished those events in some respects. Although, it's hard to tell now post-pandemic where San Diego Comic-Con is going to be, but at that time, I feel like it was this sort of mutual lifting up, right? This was the rise of geek culture. And I want to circle back to that question after, but tell me a little bit more, if you would, about that, and maybe particular segments you might remember from that time.
The biggest challenge of doing a show at Comic-Con was we had a schedule and a list of guests that were going to come on and do these live interviews with us. But the nature of Comic-Con was crowds were so, it had somebody booked a certain time, it was guaranteed they weren't going to make it because they were coming from somewhere else, and you could not get them there any faster because you couldn't move through that crowd. So we're a live show. And as we do this live show, we look ahead, okay, who's our next guest? And are they there yet? And a lot of times nope, they are not ready to go because they're not here. And it was kind of filling the show. And people, at home, they never knew it. But, Kevin and Olivia were pros. And if you needed them to pad you some time and fill some time, just that's all you had to do is tell them, like, hey, we need another 2 minutes, and they could fill whatever amount of time you would give, and the viewer would know that at home. But in the truck, we were, there was a little bit of a panic sometimes of, hey, we're so-and-so, they're supposed to be here, or we have to do this. But the executive producers were always really good at filling time, or knowing what was going to fill time, or shifting things around to make things work. And that was some of the behind the scenes that you wouldn't know at home, but was the chaos that was happening in the truck. We kind of had the similar experience at E3 where, G4 was also, we were the stars of E3. Everyone loved coming over to our booth and, watching what was going on. And we had a big setup. We were doing game demos and, talking to the biggest people in the industry. And I remember one time getting threatened by the fire marshal because we had some cameras. We were a live show. So being a live show, we had the cable cameras, and having cables in a big convention center where people are walking, have all these walking paths just that don't mix. So I often had my handheld guy roaming through the convention, or, roaming through crowds, and just wasn't popular with the fire department or the fire marshal. So my thing was always, hey, let's just do it until we get caught, and we'll get a warning from the fire marshal. We'll take the warning. After we get the warning, then we'll have to stop because we don't want to get shut down. But we were always towing that line.
Yeah, it seemed like a lot of things were like, well, don't ask permission, just ask for forgiveness. That seemed to be the operating rule.
I want to talk about just one of my favorite bits on the show.
Sure.
So one of my favorite bits on the show was this segment called Wiffle Bat Fight Club. And the pitch was we were going to have producers of the show basically in a caged arena with wiffle bats, and they would just go at it in this wiffle bat combat. And it just, just the idea of it sounds insane, but when we actually shot the bit and we did it live, it was like one of my favorite bits because these producers really went at it. Where oftentimes, there were a lot of scrapes, there was blood at times, but it was authentic. And when we were doing a live show, one of the craziest things about it too is from segment to segment, there are set changes. and we had to put in this cage, or it's a 3-wall of fences, the chain link fences that had to go on, and everyone had to change different positions, and cameras had to move, and you're doing a live show, and all this has to happen in under 3 minutes. But how everything moves so fast, and everyone, knew their jobs and got it done in that time. To me, the synchronicity was just always amazing of what could happen in a live show. And then when we got into these bits, you never knew what was going to happen. And, it was a live fight basically. And it was, I look back at those, and those were like, that was my favorite bit of all time, because just watching producers beat the heck out of each other.
Casey told me the whole story behind that too. That was pretty awesome. I want to explore a little bit about like Attack of the Show's place in television history and kind of like fandom. I do think that there's I want to talk a little bit about, or if you would, in your words, discuss the sort of cultural impact of Attack of the Show. One thing that I have observed is, my belief is that YouTube would not be what it is today without Attack of the Show, because many of the on-camera hosts, myself included, I'm not really a TV host, a TV guy, but I know a lot about movies and weird movies. And, when you look at some of the personalities that were on the show, they came preloaded with a particular expertise about whether it's like video games, like with Morgan Webb and Adam Sessler, or pop culture or comic books with Blair Butler, myself with movies. Like there was like, and I feel like that kind of migrated onto YouTube, where if you look at YouTube now, you can find, without professional on-camera experience, just here's a guy talking about comic books, here's someone talking about video games, movies, whatever it is. And in the early stages of YouTube, I think the maximum clip you could upload was 10 minutes, right? And I feel that the legacy of Attack of the Show might be these sea of voices now that are on YouTube speaking on behalf of nerd culture. That's my own belief. What do you think the cultural impact is of Attack of the Show and G4 TV? What is the legacy that's been left? And, I can't even think of another show that had an impact, went away, and then a decade later, a show of this type. I'm not talking about like a sitcom or anything, but a show of this type that like went away and then is now getting ready to relaunch. But do you have like some perspective on the impact? I mean, and I will say, in having interviewed so many people, and I've interviewed about 20 people so far, everyone, when they get interviewed on their resume, Attack of the Show, they'll see G4 Attack of the Show on the resume. And it's like, oh, people like perk up in the television industry. So it clearly had an impact, where it might not have been the most financially successful show, but it's certainly a show that people knew about. But do you have some thoughts on the cultural impact on television, impact on nerd culture, and sort of big picture thoughts on that? And first of all, I can't believe you've been directing for 30 years, because you would have had to start when you were like 5, I think. But anyways, you mentioned that earlier, and that really struck me. But
I haven't been directing for 30. I've been in the business for 30. I started. My first job was actually as a teleprompter operator, but I got my first official show as a director in 2001, I believe it was. Yeah, 2001 was my first series that I got as a director. But
wow.
Just a good-looking 51-year-old, actually.
Hey, there you go. Good. We're in the 50, I'm in the 50 club with you, so there you go. But tell me just what you think about the cultural impact, whether it's like on pop culture, nerd culture. We saw, when you track the beginning of G4 from 2005 through the end of 2000, Attack of the show itself, and G4 for the decade, nerd culture was not cool. When the network began, nerd culture was not cool. And I will say, as a matter of fact, having someone with long boxes of comic books, it was almost a source of shame, something you would hide. And now, your average, they sell Marvel T-shirts at target. It's just now nerd culture is pervasive in the mainstreamed. But do you have perspective on nerd culture impact, G4, its cultural impact? What are your thoughts on that from having been there?
Okay, not sure how much I have in it, but the one thing I can say about G4 and Attack of the Show is, to this day, I have T-shirts from the show, and you'll always have people that will spot it and like, oh my God, G4, love that show, love that network. Even though we've been off the air for like almost a decade already, that's how fans reacted to that show, and people in a nerd culture felt like at the time that show, like, they had a show, they had a place to go, they had a network to go to, and that they weren't being forgotten. They had a network specifically for them. And I think when it went off the air, other things took its place. And luckily YouTube was around where you can go in search of what you wanted to see. But at the time when G4 was around, it started as Tech TV. It was geared specifically towards nerds, and that was huge. I don't think people at the time realized how big video games are, and how much money it generates. And if you compare the release of a video game to the release of a movie, I think video games are making a lot more money, and people don't really realize that. There was an article back in the day when we were doing Attack of the Show, I think it was in Rolling Stone magazine, that called Attack of the Show one of the top 10 shows that nobody's watching. So there was an awareness of the show and how good it was, but getting it out there and getting eyes to it was a different challenge. And at the time, we were on cable TV, and the internet wasn't such a big thing. But if G4, after we had gotten taken off as a cable network, if they had switched and gone to a streaming network, I think it would be the biggest streaming network out there. It built-in audience already. We already had the nerd culture, and when we already had the fan base built in, and other companies were starting from scratch. If they had the foresight of actually just going to a streaming network at the time, I think would be the top thing out there right now.
That was great. That was a great, that was awesome. That's exactly what needed to be said. I forgot about that Rolling Stone article. That's really funny. This is a random question. Do you know what G4 means?
I have no idea. I remember it being asked somewhere, and it might have been towards the final show, and there was an explanation of it, but I don't remember what it was, or even if it was the real answer. But it was the head of the network at the time was the wife of the head of the network come? It didn't mean anything, right? I think it was just it was catchy or something, right?
There's all these theories that it meant, movies, video games, comic books, there are all these theories about what G4 means, and the truth is it means nothing. It was just made up thing that sounded cool. That's it. That's actually the true answer. So the true answer. I have two more questions if you have time.
Sure.
So my first question is about the cancellation. And I don't know if you were there during it, or you were.
Yeah, I was.
Talk about the ending, Kevin's last show. I don't know if you were there for Olivia's last show, Kevin's last show. So all the sort of endings, right? How did things end? There was Olivia left. And then my personal belief is when Kevin left, I think that was it, because it really became the Kevin Pereira and Friends show. But talk about the Olivia's exit, Kevin's exit, and then the sort of cancellation and like the last days, so to speak, and what that was like.
The ending for G4 wasn't a surprise to anyone. I think a year or so prior, it might have been 2 years prior to the ending of G4, we were all at E3, and an article had gone out about how the UFC just was interested in purchasing G4, but then that deal didn't go through, and that was like a shock to everyone. It's like, because nobody knew that the network was actually up for sale. And then after that, it was kind of on the radar that, hey, people aren't, the higher ups at this company are looking to ditch G4. And Jerry Duggan and I would always talk about it. We always had our conspiracy theories on it. But one thing was in the read-throughs for X-Play, the script read-throughs for X-Play, we were always in this room at NBC Universal or Comcast at the time, and they had a dry erase board on 3 different walls, and it was for each network that they were running in there. So G4 had its own wall, E Entertainment had its own wall, and Style Network had its own wall. So they would list the programming that was coming up for the next month. I think it's a month to 3 months. And I would point that out to Jerry. It's like, oh, we're okay, because look, they're still listing shows on the whiteboard for the next 3 months. And then one day, all of a sudden, there was nothing, for months ahead to come on G4. And I said to Jerry, we're done. And that actually came true. We got the announcement that we were they're folding up the network. And I remember the announcement they made. They brought every employee of G4 into this big conference room, and they had security there as well. And when they made the general call for this meeting, everyone knew what the announcement was going to be. And all the G4 employees came in, and it was like a party. It was already like a big rap party. People coming in, high-fiving and stuff. And I think it wasn't the reaction that the executives thought was going to happen, but they also thought that it was going to be a surprise to us. But we knew what the plan was, and that they were going to, cancel the network. So we just kind of went in there and did the only thing we could do, and we just kind of celebrated it. And that was, a funny standout moment to me, because I'm sure those executives are pretty shocked. Like, why are these people so happy? The decline of that show, or the change of that show, was we first saw on Olivia's departure. She knew, she was getting called up to the big leagues, I would say, and, getting offers on movies and stuff, and knew that her time was short on Attack of the Show. But I also think that she knew what that show was for her. It was the showcase for her that got her to where she is today. And for any of the talent that was on that show, they were able to be themselves and to show their own personalities and show what they're capable of. And it's basically, a 10-year audition tape for all those guys. I saw at the time, on Olivia's departure, she wanted to get out of some shows to do other things. And I think the network was giving her a hard time about that. So she took a stand in certain ways, and, and she did what was best for her and for her career. When Kevin decided to leave the show, it was very sad, because, to me, in a lot of the way, he was the show. But he saw the writing on the wall as well. And I think he wanted to get out, like a lot of people do when they're at the top of their game, rather than being forced out at a time. He got to choose when and how he was going to leave. And although it was sad, it was his decision. And, the show definitely changed after that, because, people were tuning in for him. He had a huge fan base, very popular guy. But I think he also, just felt that it wasn't the same. The magic was gone at that time for him, and he wasn't feeling like, it was the show that used to be. And if maybe it became work for him, and that show wasn't supposed to be work; it was supposed to be fun. And once you weren't having fun anymore, there wasn't a point in doing it. So I respect him a lot for being able to walk away from that.
I lied. I actually have two more questions, but they're quick. Can lightning strike twice? I think I mentioned earlier that I can't think of something in television history where a network literally went away and is now coming back with some of the same programming that the network launched with. Can lightning strike twice? And what are the challenges facing the network now? Because it's being relaunched in a very different time.
The relaunch of G4, I'm excited for. I really am excited for, and I'm really excited to see what they do. But there are a lot of challenges. It's a different, over a decade since that network's been gone, and technology has changed so vastly. So the challenge for the new G4 is going to be, staying ahead of technology, because the old G4 was always one step ahead. So what's next? We have to be ahead on that front. But also, I'd be interested to see, what their budgets are going to be, and how much commitment they get from Comcast or NBC Universal on that front. And I believe it can't be the same network, the same shows that it was, and they have to reinvent that. And I'm curious to see what they do, and I'm very optimistic for it, and I hope it does well. But definitely going to be a difficult task.
Well, I happen to know that Mike Shaw is overseeing it, running Attack of the Show at least. And I talked to Chris Hollandoni. I don't know if you remember him.
Yeah, sure.
He was telling me that he talked to Mike Shaw about being on it, and he said, well, yeah, you could do it, but they're paying exactly what they used to pay back in the day. So he said the pay scale is, maybe that's good from the standpoint of there'll be a new generation of kids that are willing, for them, that would be good money. But for anyone that's been in the industry and is experienced, it's not the kind of money you can, take a pay cut to go back and work on something probably fun, but that's what I'm told. And I guess my final question is there anything I didn't ask that you feel is important people should know about Attack of the Show? Something, you were a big part of it. Basically you and Genji combined directed 1,000 episodes of the show. That's just an achievement, for both of you. It's remarkable. And to have that consistency too, right? A consistent creative team, I think, is really important. There were not a lot of shakeups. There were people that were brought on or jobs evolved, but there wasn't a revolving door happens at some television shows, right? Or we're going to bring in a new team. There were kind of just a couple different teams during the whole run. But is there anything I asked you that you feel is important to add? And I also, by the way, if it's okay, I might come back to you to get some follow-up after we've got a cut of the doc. And if you want to, I can show you an early cut. It's important. It's important to me that the movie is factually accurate. So when we say something happened on a certain time, we have multiple sources to confirm. But is there anything else that I didn't ask that you'd like to add?
The one thing about this show that I think made it work was the teamwork. The teamwork all around, from producers to the technical side to editing, everything. It was a team that if the teamwork's not there, the show doesn't happen. You're doing an hour-long live show, daily live show, and everyone knows what they're responsible for and what needs to be done. Everyone knows the deadlines. And when it all comes together, it's just amazing thing to watch. And it's this chaos that happens, before a live show, but it's even more chaotic on the show because we have less time, less people, less budget, and in the end, we came out and we did a great show every single day. And that day also, we never knew what was in store for us because everything was so current. You know, you get a clip from, around the net, and then you base a huge bit off of that. And you'd say, okay, let's create this bit. This is what's going to happen. These are the props we're going to need. And for, someone in an art department to get a list of props they need to get at, 11 a.m. and say, hey, here's a list of things we need. We'd like it to be in studio by 1. And that just does not happen anywhere in this industry. And those guys, always got it done. From sometimes having, live animals on the show, just whatever crazy things. One thing we did was, Kevin trying to catch a greased pig, and they set up hay bales where this was all going to happen in, and then that pig jumped out of that pen and just ran amok in the studio, and all the producers and stuff trying to catch it. That was a great live moment. But these are things that just happen on a daily basis. You just never knew it was going to happen, and you just went with it. And the team on the show was just best in the business.
Alan, thank you so much. This was great. This was really great. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm looking forward to it. It was definitely a highlight in my career to work on this show. So I'm proud to have done it, and honored that you actually contact me to be a part of this as well.